Everybody, thanks for coming. So we're lucky that this is the last session for the day here. I get to spend as much time as I want over here all day. So essentially, I'm here just to talk about Migratekit. I know I briefly talked about it a little bit in the keynote earlier, but I'm going to go a little bit about the functionalities, how it works, and I'm also going to share a little video that one of my coworkers, Rico, did in the South Korea in the Open Infra Summit about how he did a live migration on stage. So essentially, we know that people are out of VMware. If you're in this room, you probably know why you're moving out of VMware. Many reasons why you're getting out of VMware. So I'm not going to sit and name all the reasons why you're getting out of VMware. You have your own. But what I want to talk about is Migratekit. So Migratekit is an open source migration tool that's built on top of other open source technologies such as NVDKit, libNVDKit, and essentially it's designed for zero downtime, or we'll say near zero downtime. The idea is that we're not migrating all the data while the VM is offline. We're doing the majority of the migrations while the VM is online, and then we're just doing a small delta migration while the VM is offline. So we're reducing the amount of data that we have to move when the VM is turned off. We've also tested it with Atmosphere, but one of the things that we always do in our OpenStack projects is making sure that they are OpenStack generic. So we've got people that use this project against their OpenStack clouds, and they're not necessarily using Atmosphere, which is their way of using OpenStack. If you just deploy OpenStack in any way, it'll just work because it just relies on OpenStack generic APIs. And the other thing is it doesn't matter what storage backend you use. So whether it's Ceph or Pure or any other method, you can use it. So essentially with Migratekit, we've got two phases when we do the migration. The first phase is essentially the one that we do with zero downtime. So the migrate cycle, what it does is, just jump to that. But essentially, the phase one is the online migrations that we do all the time, nonstop. That you can do as many times as you want. And then the second phase is the actual cutover, that is where the downtime happens and things move on. So in the migration phase, in the initial cycle, what we do is we do a full copy. So what we'll check is if there's a Cinder volume that matches the volume inside of VMware. If we find one, if we don't find one, we create a new Cinder volume, the same exact size, and then we take that and then we start copying the data from VMware into OpenStack from a snapshot that we create. And then that all happens using VDDK and pretty much the same exact technology that any and most VMware backup tools are using. And so by doing that, that's what we do on the first time if we don't detect an existing disk. If we detect an existing disk, we'll probably have what we call a change ID. That's what VMware uses in general, and that's the tooling that VMware provides in order to allow you to just get deltas instead of the whole copy. We store the change ID as metadata on the volume, and then we go to VMware and we say, hey, we'd like all the changes on the volume since this change ID. And then VMware ships that to us, and then we copy only those parts of the disk as opposed to the whole disk. And so what happens usually is, let's say, you've got a 10 terabyte VM, and that takes like a day to move all of that. You run it the next day, maybe like 50 gigs had changed in that 10 terabytes. And so that runs much faster. You run it again, because 50 gigs went a lot faster, it might just copy 2 gigs the next time. You run it again, it just takes seconds to move like maybe 500 megs. And so the more often you run it, the quicker the synchronization times will be. And so usually when you've got large VMs, what you want to do is you just want to keep running it every now and then. You could just run it every hour until your cutover time, and then you're cutting down on the time that you have to sit and wait for when you do the eventual cutover. So the cutover, when we do the cutover, it's very similar to what we do on a normal migration cycle. First thing we do is we run a final synchronization again while the VM's still online. And the purpose of this synchronization is to make sure that if, let's say, somebody forgot to do a sync for the past 3 days, and then a lot of data had accumulated in the VM, at least we're doing that sync of those past 3 days online rather than after we turn off the VM. So we go ahead, we do that, then we power off the VM from VMware automatically. Migratekit takes care of that for you. And then it starts an automatic synchronization again, but this time the VM is offline. And so that gives us the complete consistency because now the VM's offline, the data is going to be completely consistent across both sides. At the same time, when you're giving the cutover command, there's a couple things you can give it. You have to supply it with the MAC addresses of the VMware virtual machine, and the network ID, and subnet ID, and the IP of the system OpenStack. So by doing that, it'll automatically create ports inside OpenStack that map to the same MAC addresses in VMware. And if you forget a MAC address, it'll say, hey, you're missing a network mapping. And so it makes sure that it can create those ports ahead of time, so that assuming that you've got, a VLAN there and a VLAN here, if you do the mapping right, the VM will just wake up on the network in another segment and everything will just work. Essentially, what we do as well is we run for VDP. We've got a window to actually put some stuff in so that it can install the VirtIO drivers automatically, in case you had the VMware drivers previously. Also, if you've got a Linux VM, it can also do a bunch of stuff to make it, it'll install the QEMU guest agent and stuff like that. But we've had users that actually decided to contribute a flag to disable it. If you got a bunch of Linux VMs and they're relatively modern, they'll just boot up with no issues at all. They're just using VirtIO out of the box. And also, of course, not just that it creates the port, it also creates the VM. Everything is done and complete. So, of course, the best practices to get a successful migration is to plan it strategically, start with VMs that are not so critical, and that helps you figure out the little kinks that you've got with some of the different distributions. I work with customers where they have VMs running like SUSE 11, and that's running like 2.6 kernels, and that's got all sorts of challenges. So it's always good to kind of just work with a class of VMs and then figure out your Windows 2019s and your Windows 2012s and all of that to figure out like the pattern as you go through it. The most important thing is we have a nice table on the Migratekit documentation of what are all the different permissions that you need for the vCenter account in order to be able to take a snapshot, shut down the VM, pretty much all the necessary permissions that it needs. So what's cool about that is you don't necessarily have to just give it an admin account. You actually have a set of permissions you can add as roles and then just use that. So you don't have to give it to the world. And then obviously the most critical thing, which a lot of times that's what we have problems with, is just making sure that the network is into your OpenStack infrastructure. So if you've got like VLAN 20 in your VMware, just make sure that OpenStack has access to VLAN 20 there. So a lot of people go, oh, there's no network, why isn't it working? Turns out just the VLAN is not exposed to the other side of the infrastructure. So you just have to make sure that is in place. So like in real world case studies, this is just fancy talk to say that, hey, it's been very helpful for a lot of our customers. It's been really useful for them. Not even just it's cool because it's not even just our customers. The other day, somebody had actually, was talking in a GitHub issue where they were having like a problem, and they said, hey, we migrated 300 VMs, but we've got like 10 VMs that are having this problem. And it's pretty cool because I don't even know who they are, but it's really nice to know that, they were able to do like 300 VMs and without even us ever, telling them or talking to them and doing anything. So that's really, really, really cool. So finally, I kind of want to just say, hey, it's an open source solution. It's available for anyone to use. You can check out the GitHub there. We've got a Docker image that is unfortunately a gig or something. But what's cool about it is everything baked in. So when you want to run Migratekit, you actually just literally just do a Docker run, and you don't have to pull in the million dependencies because sometimes it requires a newer version of libnbd and and all of that other stuff. So you don't have to worry about all of that. You can just, use the Docker image that already ships out. PRs are welcome. It's an Apache 2.0 license project. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it about Migratekit now. I think I flew through this. So now I would love to show you guys a little demo that Rico did in the most recent summit. So this guy out of the way. Just in time with the clock. So here we're seeing like an ESXi environment. So obviously this works with vCenter, but truth be told between us, this is the 60-day trial ESXi. So We don't own any VMware licenses to build all this stuff, so, you know. So we started this up. So there's this VM here called Jimmy's Top Secret. This is actually because Rico is doing the presentation with Jimmy on stage. And so this VM is running here, and he actually has a 1 gig file called secret.txt, just to show that, hey, this is the actual VM there. And so essentially what he's doing in here is pretty much running the migration cycle. So he'll run that. You'll see what it does first is it creates a snapshot of the virtual machine inside VMware. And then after that, uses VDK to copy the VMDK, attaches a Cinder volume to the OpenStack VM where you're running this, and then starts to use NBD copy for a full copy because it's the first time it's running this. So this is like the first, time it's just going to do a full copy of the disk, but it'll actually skip any zeros as well. So if there's any zeros or it's an empty disk, like you create a terabyte volume, but you're only using 10 gigs, it's going to fly through it. So this is, him talking about some other stuff as this is going through. And then, so you see there's a volume there that was created that it matches the VM inside the volume inside VMware. So what he does, again, is what he did is he copied the file from secret.txt. The secret.txt got back. Imagine this is a scenario where, like, some other workload did something on the system, right? And so he actually goes ahead and does another migration cycle. And so it does the snapshot again and then starts doing the migration. But this time around, we'll see it won't say full copy needed. See, it says an incremental copy. And it'll be way faster because all he did was change a 1 gig file. And so it's just going to say, I just saw a gig change, so I'm just going to fly through this. And so that's what I meant by it's able to do these much faster if you're doing this more often. And that's it. It's done for that. And the volume it removes the snapshot, cleans up after itself. And then now the cutover time. So pretty much he goes ahead and starts the cutover command. So first here we see that it says ensuring OpenStack resources exist. That's make sure the flavor that you selected exists properly. And then it says port created. So it creates a port in Neutron to match that same exact network that's there. And then it attaches the volume. Once again, it finds the device. It starts an incremental copy again before shutting down the VM in VMware. So it went really fast because nothing happened to the VM. It's pretty idle. And then once it completes the migration cycle, it shuts down the source VM. Once the source VM is shut down, creates another snapshot and does the incremental copy again, which is this one is the post shutdown to make sure that the data is fully consistent inside of the environment. And yeah, you see that it's shut down. And then we run vert VDV in place. And what that does is set up all the drivers and everything like that. So you see that it realized that it's in Ubuntu 2024. It actually will have the QEMU guest agent installed on it for the first boot. And that takes a couple seconds. And then once that's done, it finishes the final migration and spins up the new OpenStack VM. So you'll see here that now there's their VM called Jimmy's Top Secret, the same IP, and then that's connected. And I think we were pretty short on time, so we didn't really get to show the console and show the data move, but you can take my word for it that the data didn't. So that's pretty much it on how it works. It's definitely not this, so now, this is the part where I hope that you guys have a lot of questions. I'll pass this over for it, and I'll move here. Answer questions.
Questions? Just to be clear, you're running that outside the VM that needs to be run, right?
Yeah, so essentially where we do the migrations on something we call like a quote unquote appliance VM. So you would boot a VM in OpenStack, and that VM in OpenStack would be the one communicating to the VMware cluster. The reason for that is that by doing that, we have the ability to just create a Cinder volume and attach it to that VM that you're on, and then copy the data to it. So that's how we can make it work with any kind of OpenStack environment, because as long as Cinder is there and we can mount the volume, we can copy into it from there.
Okay, so that's how you get the agent, depending on the OS.
Yeah.
all this one first. Then back to
That's all good. So with OpenStack, obviously we use key-based authentication for all of our, at least our Linux VMs, right?
Yeah.
Would that be something that after the migration, we'd have to go in and set up the keys to be used in that way? That's not gonna be added anyway.
So essentially the VM ends up being provisioned in the project that you use to create your appliance VM. So if you launch that appliance VM in project A, then the VM is going to end up living in project A, but won't have any credentials or anything. It'll have literally byte for byte exactly what was in VMware.
And it's going to, that's also gonna copy the IP address and network of how that VM is exactly as it is.
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
So in theory, so like for us, one of the easiest ways to do this would actually be to re-IP everything while it's still in VMware, and then migrate it over so
Yeah.
that when it gets to OpenStack, the network is already
Well,
set.
what you can also do, so the reasons why we have the option to do the same IP is in a scenario where you don't want to move a whole cluster and you want to move like 2 VMs at once. By having the ability to keep the same IP, and if you stretch the network, you can just move it one system at a time. But if you say, okay, I don't care, I actually don't mind taking down my whole cluster and moving everything over, you can actually give it a separate different IP. As long as you configure your VM to use DHCP, it'll just wake up with DHCP and use the OpenStack DHCP and just get it whatever IP that you gave it when you supplied the network mapping. So it actually will respect the IP that you gave it in the CLI to cutover, and not necessarily the IP that's in VMware or in the VM. So long as you set it to DHCP, then it can be built in like Neutron DHCP infrastructure.
Thank you.
No problem.
And while we're passing over the name, we do have some people online. If you're online and you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute, and you can ask your question too after Zane.
Thank you. Actually, to bounce off his question, does it keep the same MAC address? Is there the option to keep the same MAC?
Yeah.
By default?
Yeah, so we use the same MAC address because usually most operating systems don't like when the MAC address changes. And so what'll happen is if you have a certain network configuration in one system and you move it to the other, all your IP address config will disappear off the system, the MAC address changes. So what we do is when we create the network mapping in the cutover command, the network mapping consists of the MAC address, the network ID in Neutron, the subnet ID in Neutron, and then the IP address. And the MAC address is kind of like the key to say, okay, this MAC address of this network interface in VMware would be recreated like in Neutron with this same MAC address. So you will end up with the same MAC address in Neutron afterwards.
And I did have one more question, sorry. When it comes to the V2V morphing stage,
Yeah.
for, let's say, the source disk was using labels in SCF tab, will it be able to convert that to like maybe using the UID and OpenStack, or will that be able to translate?
So when it comes to Vert V2V, we actually just run it on the boot drive only. And in my experience, most of the time it just goes up fine. What I have, it doesn't actually mess up with the UUIDs. So actually when the migration completes, a lot of times the volumes, or if using LVM, even with Windows, things will work just fine. I've seen some bug reports with volumes showing up as offline in Windows after the migration. So they just have to log into the system, just right click, enable or activate. But we're not a very big Windows shop, so these things, and these things also, I want to say they're more Vert V2V specific. So these are not things that we could sort. We'd have to delegate to the Vert V2V community and ask there.
Time for one or two more questions.
So this may be, there might be some nuances to this, but in that when it copies, it doesn't copy over blank bytes. Does that affect anything with like LVMs, running multi-disk LVMs?
No, actually, what it does is essentially, if you've got multi-disk LVMs, it goes, and one of the things that it does is, in this case, we saw one volume, but if you've got like 10 volumes, it'll actually get a list of all the volumes and start copying them one by one. And then when it attaches them to the VM, it also attaches them in the same order that they were inside VMware. So in my experience, for the most part, I've seen LVMs on multi-disk, they wake up with no issues, because the order, like, it's still like dev VDA and VDB, and like that kind of mostly looks the same, without too many issues. But once again, whenever you're playing this kind of thing, when you're just like re-imaging stuff out to another system, you know, there's gonna be like some stuff that you might have to play with every now and then.
Anybody else? Anybody online?
Well, I have one more thing to add.
Oh, of course.
Anybody hasn't signed up to win a free GoPro, you can still win a free GoPro. Your chances are pretty high.
I take it right here.
I don't even have one.
You don't have our own?
No, I don't know if I should get
It's
one.
probably a conflict of interest.
Yeah, that probably.
I wasn't gonna sign up either because I felt like there might be a conflict.
I just get the whole roll.
I think I deserve it though.
Yeah, I
I
know.
know my number.
Next time we'll bring two, one for you. and-
All right, thank you very much for your
Thank you
presentation.
very
Thank
much,
you for
everyone.
all of our sponsors for their presentation.